Today is February 17, 2017, and we'll be continuing on our investigation of the community rule. So before we get into that, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. King and Queen and Prince and Princess of the universe, thank you so much for caring about us enough to work out this whole plan of salvation and to bring us a knowledge of the truth, to shine light on us while we've been in such great darkness. Thank you so much, brother, for sacrificing yourself and coming to the world on our behalf and to send us the Spirit of truth to guide us into all truth. We recognize that we have been so far off in our characters and in our way of thinking, and we've really just been on the path of darkness. So please help us to understand the principles of the path of truth more clearly than we ever have in the past. Help us tonight to really move beyond our present attainments. Thank you so very much. Please guide us in this discussion. We ask these things, Father, Mother, B'Shem Tzemach, Hu He, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so as you guys know, we've been studying the community rule, and I think it works well to give a brief recap of things at the beginning of every meeting in case there's anyone new on, or later for people who might listen to the recordings, they get some sort of idea of what we are investigating. So the community rule, as I'm sure you guys, at least those of you who have been on previous studies know, is a document that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it is a very important document for a number of reasons, one of which is that it outlines the basic purpose as well as the teachings and practices of the community who housed the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that community and their teachings and so on and so forth clearly formed somewhat of the foundation of the Nazarene movement. In other words, the ideas and the practices and the whole approach to Judaism put forward by the teacher of righteousness, who was the prophet and founder of the community, largely influenced Jesus and his early followers. And we've gone through such questions in the past, and we can talk about it more if need be as we continue on through the community rule. But we've asked questions like, what did John the Baptist and Jesus and Paul and the various apostles, what did they think of the teacher of righteousness? Did they think he was a false prophet, or did they think he was a true prophet? And the more we study these questions, the more it becomes plain that they really could not have viewed him as a false prophet. They would have had to view him as a true prophet. If they viewed him as a false prophet, that would be inconsistent with all of the available information that we have with us. However, if we just look at the information and see particularly how the Nazarene movement dealt with the ideas which were unique and original to the teacher of righteousness, it becomes plain that they were in agreement with those ideas and picked them up and expanded them and brought them into their own setting. So the community rule, of course, the section that we are investigating at the present time is actually the section which outlines one of the most foundational teachings of the teacher of righteousness, that being the teaching of the two spirits or the two ways. And we've been looking at 1QS. 1QS is the best preserved copy of the community rule found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. 1 is for Cave 1, Q is for Qumran, S is for Serek, which is the first word of the Hebrew title of the community rule, which is Serek Ha-Yahad, the rule of the community, or the community rule. And this section is really outlining a certain system of ideas. And it's saying that this is something that the master or the instructor is to teach to the children of light. He is to teach them that there are two principles in this world. There is the true and there is the false. Truth is represented by light, and falsehood is represented by darkness. And this describes the characteristics of those two principles and the impact of those two principles. It also describes the origin of the principles, the history of the principles, and the final end of one of them. The final end of the spirit of falsehood coincides with the final establishment and commencement of the uncontested reign of the spirit of truth. And it describes how these two principles are as adversaries or rivals in the present world, contending against each other, and that each person is a partaker of one principle or the other, that we are either on the path of light or on the path of darkness. And if we are on the path of darkness, we are in the dominion of the Prince of Darkness and all of those allied with him. But if we are on the path of truth, we are in the dominion of the God of Israel and the angel of his truth, or the messenger of his truth. And we have their help while the messenger of darkness contends against us. So this is what we've been reading about. This is the basic idea being set forth. And in column 4 of 1QS, which is where we are presently at, we are a ways down in column 4, but we're in column 4. In this column, it describes the ways of each of these principles. So what are the ways of the spirit of truth in the world? And it describes the ways, how this spirit is for the enlightenment of the mind of humanity. And the purpose of the Spirit is so that all the paths of true righteousness might be made straight before us, so that the fear of the laws of God may be instilled in our heart. It is a spirit of humility, patience, abundant love, unending goodness, understanding, and intelligence, a spirit of mighty wisdom which trusts in all the deeds of God and leans on his great loving kindness, a spirit of discernment in every purpose, of zeal for just laws, of holy intent with steadfastness of heart, of great love towards all the children of truth, of admirable purity which detests all unclean idols, of humble conduct sprung from an understanding of all things, and of faithful concealment of the mysteries of truth. These are the foundations of the Spirit to the children of truth in this world. So that's 1 QS, column 4, line, let's see, this is about 1 to 7. Or 2 to 7, perhaps. Again, the translation that I'm working from primarily right now is the Giza Vermes translation, the complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, and he only marks which line of the column the text or the translation is at for every 5 lines. So those are the attributes of the Spirit of Truth. And in our studies, we've gone through and investigated each of these and discussed them and compared the understanding of them as we find here with the understanding of them as we find elsewhere in other ancient Jewish scriptures. And we've tested them to find out, are these things really based on truth? Is this really describing what the way of truth is like? And we found every step of the way, yes, it absolutely is. And then, of course, after this, there's the description of the final outcome, the final visitation of all who walk in the Spirit of truth. And it describes it as being healing and great peace and a long life and fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing and eternal joy in life without end, a crown of glory and a garment of majesty and unending light. Following this, there is the section which we are currently in, the section which describes the ways of the principle of falsehood. What are these? Greed and slackness in the search for righteousness, wickedness and lies, haughtiness and pride, falseness and deceit, cruelty and abundant evil, ill temper and much folly, and brazen insolence, abominable deeds committed in a spirit of lust, and ways of lewdness in the service of uncleanness, a blaspheming tongue, blindness of eye and dullness of ear, stiffness of neck and heaviness of heart, in order to walk in all the ways of darkness and guile. So this is what we've been investigating. We have investigated up to ill temper. That's what we discussed last week. And so far we've found that, yes, indeed, all of these various characteristics are actually characteristics of the spirit of falsehood. They really do spring from falsehood, which is, again, just contrary claims to reality. So the next one that we will look at is much folly. But before we do that, I just wanted to see if anyone had comments or questions on the broader issues surrounding the community rule or this section of the two spirits in particular or anything like that. And if not, just you can mention that you're ready to get into the next one.
I don't have any questions.
We're ready.
Okay, excellent. So, much folly. What is folly and what does it have to do with falsehood?
So I would say just kind of getting involved in the things of this world that have no purpose towards, moving towards the kingdom. I mean, like going to movies or reading novels or, surfing the internet, getting involved in conspiracy theories, a lot of hobbies that aren't something, developing a skill that could be useful in the kingdom, that kind of thing.
Sounds like a lot of waste.
Well, the word that came to my mind for folly is foolishness.
Yeah. And I just looked up in the New Oxford American Dictionary, and the way that it defines folly is, first and foremost, lack of good sense, foolishness. And then as an example, an act of sheer folly, a foolish act, idea, or practice. And it defines foolish as a person or action lacking good sense or judgment, unwise.
Well, you have in Proverbs Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly, complete opposites.
True.
Yeah, I think folly also could, in the, I guess it falls under wisdom, but it, if we don't participate in folly, we're a lot safer. We can get ourselves into trouble by doing needless things. If we're going to get into trouble, we should do it, advancing the truth, not advancing folly.
Amen. Yeah, that it just got me thinking, how it's interesting how these definitions are talking about a lack and, a lack of wisdom or lack of good sense, unwise. It's a lot of unlack, those sorts of things. It's a subtraction of something. It is a lack of an element. It's something missing rather than being something of itself. And, it made me want to look up the definition for wise as well. I know we've looked at this before. But how the dictionary defines wise is having or showing experience, knowledge, and a good judgment. Now that's quite interesting because we have found that experience is knowledge derived from experiment. So to be wise is actually to have an experiential or an experimental knowledge of something, and that something always must be truth.
Makes me think of the wise virgins.
So you cannot have knowledge of something that is not true. It's impossible to have knowledge of something that is not true because there is no evidence for it, and knowledge is the state of awareness of the evidence that demonstrates something to be true. So it's really interesting how wisdom is the state of having that knowledge, which means it's being acquainted with the truth. So if folly is actually the lack of wisdom, then I'll let you guys finish that. How does that relate in connection with the other things that I was just saying?
You would lack experience, which means you would lack knowledge
of
the truth, of evidence of the truth.
Of truth, yeah. And if you lack knowledge of the truth, what are you left with?
Nothing.
And in
foolishness,
which is part of and based on, because what we're trying to define is folly, which is foolishness.
Mm-hmm. Lies, wickedness.
Yeah, falsehood. So that demonstrates definitely that folly has its root in the spirit of falsehood, because folly is lacking wisdom, and wisdom is having or possessing a genuine knowledge of the truth. It's being acquainted with truth. So if you lack a genuine knowledge of the truth, then all you have is falsehood. So that's quite a direct connection. Any other comments?
I would just say that Satan has built an empire on people gaining experience in things that are folly. I mean, there is like there are experts in areas that are total folly. Like, for example, free-face mountain climbing. It's dangerous. It's not going to advance the kingdom. It's, there's no real purpose in it. It's just to achieve a cheap thrill. But there's people who are experts in it that know how to read the rock and, if an area is, going to give way or not, and, where to put their hands, where to put their feet, and even an expert in terms of expertise in terms of bodybuilding and that kind of thing to achieve the kind of musculature that they would need to do one of those climbs. But they would be defined by the world as an expert. And they have experimental knowledge, but it's of something that's just insanity.
Yeah, it's the way that you're approaching it is interesting, because it is looking at the big picture and saying, okay, even if you have something that in an isolated sense is, a certain degree of expertise and all of that, it can still be folly. And even if it is something that's true and even good, let's say, so let's expand it a little bit, even something that's really, really good, but it's not what's needed now, and something else is really needed now, then to do that good thing isn't necessarily going to be good within its context, because we're not operating in a bubble. We have a whole world, and we're all connected to each other in some way, and what we do makes a difference. So we really should devote our time to the things that matter, because no matter what we're doing, so long as it is not in some way contributing to the upbuilding of the kingdom of truth, then it is folly. So amen to that. Another thing, in terms of being experts of something, amen. In terms of being experts of something, it's kind of interesting. Before you mentioned, rock climbing or bodybuilding, different things like that, and you just mentioned the idea of someone being an expert in a certain field, and they may have a lot of knowledge about things in that field, but it still ultimately is folly. The first example that came to my mind, actually, was theology. Of course, I'm not thinking of theology in terms of the sorts of things that we're learning, but all the philosophical theology in the various religions of the world today, and how, ultimately it's philosophizing and theologizing nothingness, because it's all based on an immaterial God. And, ology is study of something, and theo is from the Greek theos, God, and so it's the study of God, but God is defined in such a way that God is nothing. God is ultimately just an immaterial, or a proposed immaterial being. And so all this study is based on this, and it's just ideas about what this non-physical being is like. And there are people who have devoted their lives to this. And it reminds me of a statement from Victor Hodeff that is in track number 5, The Final Warning. And he said, too much knowledge, but too little understanding. And he was actually talking about Uriah Smith's interpretation of the 7 trumpets of Revelation, and how, there's a lot of knowledge there, knowledge about history, knowledge about, the details of the book of Revelation, and so on and so forth. But it's with so little understanding. It doesn't take into account the principles of how Revelation is working. It does not put pieces of knowledge together rightly, or well. So that kind of reminds me of how so much theology is. And, if someone's going to be an expert in something today, even if it's not directly related to this message or something, it would be nice for it to be something genuinely useful. If people are really becoming an expert in whether it's cancer research, or whether it is how the brain works, or something having to do with health or the human body, or some sort of science or technology, or something along those lines. Even history can be useful. Some areas of history far less useful than others, but it'd be good for people to focus on things that really matter. And most theology it's probably one of the most useless disciplines that I know of. Quote-unquote biblical scholarship is not useless, but a lot of theology is, because it's just what Paul would refer to as vain philosophies. Anyone else have comments in regard to much folly?
Those were all real great examples. I can't think of any more.
I suppose that folly is pretty straightforward.
Pretty much.
So, Heavenly Family, if there's anything else for us to gain here right now in regard to folly, and particularly much folly, help us to understand it.
I'll say one thing that's come to my mind just now real quick. It's interesting how it's grouped with ill temper.
That's one way to translate it. Other translations don't group them the way that this is grouped.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. It's just that this is a way to divide it up so it's easier to read in English.
Right.
Yeah. But I looked up here, I'm doing a search in the book of Proverbs in the NET for the word folly. And it's interesting because, I'm noticing Proverbs 9:13 The woman called Folly is brash. She is naive and does not know anything.
Whoa.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting connection to some of the aspects of what we've been discussing. Then Proverbs 13:16, every shrewd person acts with knowledge, but a fool displays his folly. So it's being contrasted with knowledge. And then we have Proverbs 14:8. The wisdom of the shrewd person is to discern his way, but the folly of fools is deception. So
falsehood.
Falsehood, exactly. It's definitely connecting folly with lies or deception, and it also contrasts it with wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Another one, Proverbs 14:18. The naive inherit folly, but the shrewd are crowned with knowledge. So folly versus knowledge. Proverbs 14:24. The crown of the wise is their riches, but the folly of fools is folly. I mean, what else do you get? Folly brings folly, and more folly, which is probably why it doesn't just say folly here in the community rule, it's much folly. Because one misunderstanding or misperception of reality leads to another.
Mm.
And a folly of thought leads to folly of action. And, I mean, there's so much that takes place in this world not based on wisdom, not based on experimental knowledge, that is ultimately folly. Wars are fought over very stupid things that are even misunderstandings. People think something is one way, and so they react, and something bad happens. You know, there's a lot that can take place in terms of horrible things due to misconception. And it reminds me, there was I'm forgetting right now if it was the president of Iraq or Iran, but a Middle Eastern country.
Right, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and there was almost a war started with Israel over a prank tweet on Twitter, where someone tweeted that
recently.
Yeah, this was recently. Someone tweeted that, like, some negative thing toward the country, and it was supposed to be from Israel or something like that, and they basically responded with a really serious threat, and Israel was like, "Whoa, okay, wait a second," and then they explained how, hey, this wasn't from us, and then they found out what it was, and turned out it was a prank and all of that, and it's like, you know, the people didn't take the time to really verify it first. They were acting on not genuine knowledge because they didn't do an experiment. They were acting by folly, and it could have brought the death of millions, literally. It's a good thing that situation was avoided, but that sort of thing happens. And so it's just really important to have a clear understanding of the way things really are. And I also want to mention that this highlights the fact that it is never appropriate to act without knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
It's never appropriate to just, oh, well, you know what, yeah, I don't really have an experimental knowledge of something, of this thing or that thing or whatever, but this thing, it's not that important. I'm just going to go with this because I like it, or because this is the way I've thought, and I don't see a reason to change it. No. We need to base everything off knowledge. Yes?
You know what this makes me think of?
What?
Is secondhand information that you don't take the time to verify, and maybe you even don't realize or recognize that there's even a possibility that it might not be true. But what I've been coming to realize is that just because it doesn't seem obvious to me that there's any possibility that it couldn't be true, doesn't mean that that's the case. And, there are certain examples that are very obvious to me that I do recognize that it would just be so wrong and such a bad idea to make a judgment about something based on secondhand information. And we do it all the time. And I see how easy it is for the carnal nature to be lax in carrying that principle through in all aspects of life. We might be willing to really adhere to that principle in certain situations. Like maybe we've gotten to the point where we can see how bad it would be to make a judgment about someone's religious beliefs, let's say, without understanding what their beliefs really teach. And then, realize that, okay, well, I can't make a judgment or take an action against that, or I can't say something to this person about something that I don't know anything about. It might be that we've kind of come to a point where something like that could be obvious, but then something else related to a different circumstance, it just doesn't occur to us. So how to get to the point where we just never do that? And it's going to take retraining. Like, we really need to be more in the habit of asking questions, examining ourselves, and just recognizing that we need to not be so self-confident.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think what it boils down to is that we think that we have good discernment, at least in certain areas. We might realize that we don't have the best discernment in some areas, but when it comes to this, like let's say we think, I recognize I don't have the best discernment in a social situation. But when it comes to mechanics, I have the best discernment. I know everything I need to know about mechanics, or whatever the case may be. Whatever maybe your hobby is, or your profession, or whatever, you think you're really good at it. And maybe you really are, but maybe there's always something more to learn. And it just goes against our grain to not have that self-confidence, because we have really been taught by society that, hey, we need self-esteem. And I'm not talking about lack of self-esteem in the sense of thinking bad about ourselves or thinking that we're incapable or, not worth anything. It's not that at all. It's just recognizing, do I know everything? No, I don't. So could I be wrong about this, or could that other person be wrong without any evil intention even? Hey, we just got to ask more questions and gain more knowledge, or gain knowledge, period.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we think something is knowledge, and it isn't knowledge. Now, I had an experience this week recently where I thought something was knowledge. It's like, Well, that really isn't knowledge, is it? It was quite a revelation for me, but I'm grateful for it, and I've been contemplating that sort of thing ever since, thinking, man, it's taken me so long to get even to the point where I'm starting to recognize I just don't know. How am I ever going to get to the point to be able to really explain this to the rest of the world where they can get it right away? But I know our Heavenly Family, they've promised that it's not by might or by strength, but by their Spirit.
Amen. So there are some more references here to folly in Proverbs, and I might just read a few more of them just because I think it does highlight some of these principles. So the next one I'll read here is Proverbs 14:29. The one who is slow to anger has great understanding, but the one who has a quick temper exalts folly. Now that's interesting how the previous one was ill temper or quick temper.
Right.
And folly is what's the result of that, or it's exalted by the person with quick temper. And here folly is actually contrasted with understanding.
Well, call wisdom thy sister and understanding thy intimate friend.
Yeah.
Proverbs 7:4.
So another one, Proverbs 15:2, the tongue of the wise treats knowledge correctly, but the mouth of the fool spouts out folly. Proverbs 15:14, the discerning heart seeks knowledge, but the mouth of fools feeds on folly. Interesting here how...
Sounds like gossip.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting how the previous one is the mouth of the fool spouts out folly, and this one is the mouth of the fool feeds on folly.
They both sound like gossip.
Taking in and putting out. Proverbs 15:21, folly is a joy to one who lacks sense. But one who has understanding follows an upright course. It's interesting there how an upright course is connected to having understanding. And the reason why that's interesting to me is because knowing what is true, understanding what is true, and how the various elements of knowledge fit together guides one to do things right. So a knowledge of the truth has a direct connection with doing things the right way. Proverbs 16:22. Insight is like a life-giving fountain to the one who possesses it, but folly leads to the discipline of fools. So folly is contrasted with insight. Yes, this next one that I'll read is quite, it's one that I've contemplated often. Proverbs 18:13. The one who gives an answer before he listens, that is his folly and his shame.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Now, that's pretty well describing, and that it's actually defining folly. It says that is his folly and his shame. Why? He didn't gain an experimental knowledge. So, for instance, I'll connect this back to what Teresa said about secondhand information. Well, you might hear from someone, oh, those Davidians, they want to slaughter all the Seventh-day Adventists. Okay, well, someone heard that from someone who heard that from someone who heard that from someone. where does it really come from and what evidence is there? But what happens is that people hear that, they accept it by secondhand information, and then a Davidian comes to them to present something to them, and they give the answer before they listen. Oh, no, I know that that's false because of this. Well, that's folly. Why? Because there was no genuine knowledge. Someone just accepted something because it happened to fit with their preconceptions. This happens all the time. And it can happen on many different levels. And I know this is, again, going back to the things Teresa was saying. But someone might feel at liberty to just believe something without evidence on what they consider to be more minor points. So they might hear someone say, oh, guess what just happened with politics? Guess what Donald Trump just did, or whatever. And so, oh, really? They might think that that is what really happened and don't question whether or not it happened. Oh, wow, can you believe that? Can you believe that happened? And then they start telling their friends, oh, can you believe what Donald Trump just said or what he just did or whatever, and just passing it along as if it's true when you really don't. Or you hear some story of some miraculous thing happening and you have no evidence for it, but you really like the story and, oh, well, that must have happened, and so you pass it along, and it might not be true. People pass on what they consider to be support of their ideas, and so people misrepresent experiments in quantum physics, and then someone hears about that, and then they pass it on with a misrepresented version of it, and it promulgates an error. So again, this can happen in regard to pretty much anything, health things like, oh, I heard that, bananas have this nutrient, or bananas are good for this. Okay, well, hey, pass that on. That sounds good. Well, wait, did you verify that bananas are actually good for that? There's some people who think that a certain thing, whatever it may be, there's tons of things, but some people think that certain vegetables or herbs or fruit or whatever it may be, a certain supplement is just going to heal everything. It's literally just, this can heal everything. And the people hear that, and they hear some good testimonies from people, and they pass it on as if they know what it is, when they don't actually know. They haven't gained any genuine knowledge. I'm wanting to give different examples in regard to different things, because it's important to recognize, hey, wait a second, maybe I haven't applied this in that area. And a good exercise would be reading The Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9 again, and going through these various categories. And, okay, well, how about archaeology? Is there something that you heard and you happen to accept a certain archaeological claim, but you don't really know, you never really checked into it? How about history or politics or philosophy or whatever it may be, health? It doesn't matter. Any field of knowledge, people hear things and they pass it on without really knowing the truth of it because they haven't checked into it. So you might watch a debate between a Christian and a non-Christian, and a Christian might say something about the religion of the other person, and you assume that it's the case because, they said it and they're in agreement with you. Or if they're debating a non-religious person, they might misrepresent the other person's views, and you might believe that misrepresentation because believing it props up your understanding of the world. But we have to avoid that because all of that is folly. So there's, I guess, more to be said about these things. But anyone else with comments or questions in regard to the things we've been discussing?
What if it happened to us that we listen a message from you, but then we did not really do study, research, and then we tell other people about the information, the new doctrine, and so what does it make us look like? Are we also be in that situation too? Even though this information, the concept was true, but we don't really know. So that's the one. And then we pass on, and then we are not really ready for it. Then we will question by it, and then we cannot answer the question.
That's an excellent question. I'll repeat it. So the question is, what about when we come on these meetings, let's say, and we hear something that I present, or you guys hear something that I present, and let's say you don't really check into it. And so you go and you spread it to others because you believe it's true, but you haven't actually gained a real knowledge of it. Is that doing the same thing? And the answer is yes, absolutely. That is doing the same thing. And in some ways, it's even worse because it is treating that which is true as though it is not. It's treating it the same way people treat error, and thus causing it to be indistinguishable from error from the point of view of those who are looking. And so we have to really make sure that we know. And that's why we have to study the message to verify it for ourselves rather than just coming and hearing and believing. Because if you believe this message without actually knowing that it's true, you simply don't know, and therefore you may as well believe any other message. You know, it's not going to really make a difference for you if you don't do a personal investigation to test it yourself. At that point, it just becomes a fluke that you happen to believe something right. You know, if your methodology leads you to believe false things and true things, and you're believing things not because of evidence, but because of any other reason, it is actually, I mean, it's not a surprise that people will end up believing some true things if that's what they're doing. And some people will end up believing true things doing that, but that's not because it's true. It's because they happen to like it, or whatever it may be, whatever reason. There could be lots of reasons why people believe things, but if it's not because of gaining a knowledge of it, then it's not genuine belief, or it's not well-grounded belief, and it is folly. Now, I want to distinguish between this and another aspect of what you said, Rachel. One of the things that you mentioned is, you know, someone may ask you a question and you might not know the answer. Let's say if someone doesn't really study, they don't check it out, and then they go and they can't answer the questions. That may happen, and doubtless that will happen to someone who has not gained a knowledge of the truth of the message. But I do also have to say that all of us are limited in our knowledge, and all of us can and will be asked questions which we do not know the answer to, and that's okay. The difference is the person who studies to show themselves approved, the person who gains an experimental knowledge of the truth, will know what they know and what they don't know. And when they are but basically they won't be promoting things that they do not know to be true. And thus, when people ask them questions on the things that they are promoting, they will know the answers, at least in terms of showing that what they've been saying is true. But there might be elements that they've never thought of before. And then they would just say, oh, well, I've never considered that. I'll look into that more and get back to you. And you can do that, and that's perfectly fine. Or someone might ask you a question about something that you haven't been making claims concerning. And in that situation, you can just simply say, I don't know. And so you're not claiming knowledge on it because you know you don't know whatever it is. And so, it's okay for people to ask questions without us having the answer. And if we don't have the answer for something, we can say we don't know. And just because we don't have an answer to a question doesn't mean that we don't have experimental knowledge of the broader subject. It only means that we don't have experimental knowledge concerning the question that they asked.
This is all making me think of what we were reading this morning. And I'm trying to remember where it was, what you were reading from, something Ellen White. And she was talking about how when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness, it was that setting, and how he recognized Satan immediately, even though he came disguised as an angel of light. He recognized him, but he didn't necessarily say so right away. He didn't, how did she put it? He didn't tell all that he knew. And part of the reason why she was saying that that was the right thing to have done was because when you provide all your reasons for something, then you give the devil more opportunity to argue and twist the reasoning, like confuse reasoning, and provide false reasoning. And it's subtle. I mean, anybody who thinks that they can outsmart the devil is foolish. I'll just say it point blank. That's absolutely ridiculous. I don't care how much truth we know. He's been around a lot longer, and he's just really a higher being than we are. We were created a little lower than the angels, and it won't be until when we have our new bodies that we'll be made a little higher than the angels. So right now we're a little lower than Lucifer, than Satan. And he's always going to be smarter, wittier, more clever, more, whatever, if we are working in our own strength and just thinking that, well, we can just give him all of our reasons and just discuss with him something. Well, Jesus didn't do that.
He just spoke the straight truth.
Yeah. He just rebuked him and just countered. What he did was he countered the implication and the lie with the truth. And it was just a simple, straight thing. He didn't go on with a discourse. And there's something about the whole discussion that's reminded me of that.
There's another element of what you're saying that reminds me of something else that we discussed a little later in the day that also relates to this and believing things based on evidence and so on. So I want to share that too. But before that, I just want to ask, Rachel, does this answer your question?
Yeah. So maybe I think my conclusion would be, if I learn something new, like let's say the Godhead, and until I gain more knowledge about that, otherwise just don't say anything. Not to say anything, not to just pause and think, and logically make sense to myself and other people. Then the times come, then share it. Otherwise, then I will look like a fool because the information is not. Then I mean, then I will be like, okay, I just listened to your YouTube thing for a few hours. That makes really sense to. I thought it makes sense to me, but then I'm not able to express it. That's the problem.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's definitely good to like if you recognize. Oh wait, I haven't really studied that yet. I don't really know it myself. Then it's best to, share the things that you know, but don't share the things that you don't know yet. So, but once you come to know it, then you should definitely start to share it. And it's fair to share what we know, even if we don't know every other thing connected to it, because then, of course, everything is connected to everything and we'll never share anything at all. So if we learn something like, if we learn that, hey, being justified is actually to be made righteous. Well, if we realize that, even if we don't know of everything throughout all the scriptures that deals with it and all of that, but if we can demonstrate that that's what it means, if we really know that, and even if us demonstrating that is just a short thing and we just have a few evidences, but enough to show that that is the case, then that's okay. We can share that so long as we have enough evidence to determine the truth. Then that's the point when we should start sharing. If we don't have enough evidence to really know that it's true, then of course then we shouldn't share it because we don't really know. But another aspect to that too is that, and actually I'll just connect this to the other element I was going to mention. Often people think, and this dovetails with what Teresa was talking about, people think that the devil, because he's so sly and because he has such great deceptions, then basically, the devil could make it appear as though there's so much evidence in favor of something that's contrary to what we have believed. So the safer thing is to just keep believing what we believe, even if the evidence points in a different direction. Mm-hmm. And that's a fear-based way to do things. People are afraid of being deceived, and so therefore it's just easier to believe what they have been taught, even if the evidence runs against it, because they can always attribute the evidence to being a deception from the devil. And, he's so much smart, and I'm not that smart, so I can't end up changing my belief because he could be just fooling me. So there's huge problems with that, but people actually sometimes state that. I've had people state that to me, that, I'm not going to investigate this because I could just be deceived and the devil's just smarter. And, even if all the evidence that I could see points in that direction, it could just be the devil deceiving me, so I'm not going to really, check into that. And people end up going and believing things against the evidence because they think it could just be a deception. Well, here's the problem. Couldn't it also be a deception to believe whatever in spite of the evidence? I mean, couldn't that be a deception, to come to just stay where you're at and not change when evidence is presented to you? And it couldn't, if you believe that your conclusion is correct and it's not a matter of the evidence, well, what about other people with other conclusions and they don't have evidence for what they're saying? How are you any different from them? That's a question that could and should be asked to someone in that position. And another way to look at it is that since both could be deceptions, how would you rather be deceived if you must be deceived? Or if there's a chance that you are deceived or are going to be deceived, is it more justifiable to be deceived by not looking at the evidence and just sticking with your gut or whatever, sticking with whatever you happen to like or think or be comfortable with, against what appears to be the evidence? Or is it more justifiable to honestly believe what you can determine to be the case according to the presently available evidence? Even if you're wrong, isn't that more justifiable? I mean, who can really hold you down for that? Who can really pin you and accuse you for doing something wrong for that? Even if you end up with the wrong understanding, you're doing the best you can if you're going with the evidence. And so if someone wants to use the whole idea of deception and how you could be deceived, again, you could say that about anything. But if we don't go by the evidence, we're just really fooling ourselves.
What if, and that's when we're talking about studying or researching things, but what if when people do that towards other people, in the sense of, getting along and all of a sudden the person does something and they feel that, they don't want to be deceived again, when they feel that, every time I let my guard down with this person, the person does something, and next time I'm just, going to hold my guard up. I'm not going to get deceived. Is that the same type of mentality? Is that the same thing? When they put together their own evidence and as to why they shouldn't give the other person or look in the best light of the other person, because they felt the person betrayed them or deceived last time, and so therefore, everything they're looking at, even if the person may not have deceived them in the last time, but they've conjured this thought up inside of their head, and so, they're not looking for evidences or anything. The evidence is just being twisted, and it's just saying inside of their mind, well, I'm not going to be deceived again by the devil, so therefore, basically, they're just looking out for everything that person does in a bad light. I mean, we're talking about this in the sense of studying and information being brought, but how does that fall in regards to that aspect in the light of that type of thought?
Okay, so the circumstance, the way that you presented it, isn't quite what I was referring to, but it does have some similarities. The difference is that in that instance, the one that you're presenting, it's not that the person is saying, I don't care about evidence, I'm going to stick with what I believe because the devil could be deceiving me with evidence or with what appears to be evidence. Whereas the situation I was talking about is specifically when people decide that they actually either don't care about what evidence is and what is presented, or they're just not going to look at it because they think that the devil could convince them with what the evidence is. That's the difference.
But couldn't that also fall in the same way a person is dealing with other people, though? Is that they don't want to see the evidences so that they could continue, because so they continue to believe what they believe in order to dealing with other people. I'm just saying that for some reason I'm sitting here, and while you're saying all of these things, I'm just thinking of a scenario, and I'm going, in my thoughts, that's literally almost like this. There's a lot of parallel to what you're saying. Only it's not an issue of studying, but it's an issue of allowing themselves to, a fear of being deceived, and so therefore they turn things off.
So the similarity between the circumstances is someone being afraid of being deceived. But again, I wanted to express the difference between what you're talking about and what I'm talking about, because they are two different things. However, what I'm talking about could, have a manifestation in a social context where, rather than it being that someone manufactures evidence or considers something to be evidence when it really isn't, which is what you were mentioning, so there could be a circumstance where someone, let's say, is actually being really negative towards someone, and all the evidence shows that, it isn't a good idea for me to deal with this person in this way because they have evidenced whatever it is, whether their untrustworthiness or their antagonism, let's say. Let's say someone's evidenced their antagonism. If someone was going to say, well, I just don't want to believe that this person's antagonistic to me, so even all the evidence that this person is, that's just too awful a thing, so I'm not going to consider that evidence. I'm just going to believe what I want regardless. That would be more parallel to the circumstance that I'm describing. And that could be either way. Whether it's the person being negative or the person being positive, someone could be very well-meaning to a person and constantly evidence their love and affection for the person, but let's say the person is afraid of commitment or whatever it may be, and so they could, be afraid of accepting the evidence of the other person's love and discard it because they're afraid of being deceived by the individual, let's say, and that would be a fault-finding way of doing it. With the circumstance that you are framing, the key thing would be that the individual has to determine whether what they believe to be evidence is actual evidence, and everything falls on that. Because if it is actually the case that it is evidenced where an individual is antagonistic to someone or whatever, and all the evidence points in that direction, then the person should know it and act accordingly. If that is not actually valid evidence, and the person isn't actually being antagonistic to them, well, then that's where they have to figure out this isn't valid evidence, and then they have to go with that. In that circumstance, it all depends on where the evidence actually points, and the individual who is basing their decisions based on what they perceive to be evidence needs to test whether they are skewing reality and thus having a misperception, or whether that is actually the case.
But if they're already, the very nature of deception means that you're deceived. So if you are being deceived, how then are you able to actually, I seldom see a deceived person that's going to sit there and actually say, okay, I'm being deceived right now, and so therefore I must evaluate. The tendency would be, no, I'm not being deceived, and they would go with whatever, quote, skewing of the evidence that they have so that they could validate their skewing of the evidence because they're deceived.
Not necessarily. Everyone who has ever gone from believing something wrong to believing something right is someone who has experienced being in a state of deception and then doing experiment to come to the truth. And that's kind of the story of this message. And so, basically the problem with someone who is deceived, let's say in regard to another person, the problem is not that they've just been so deceived and that's it. It's just that they haven't been doing genuine experiments. So someone could realize, oh, wait, I need to do genuine experiments in order to test my perception, and they could actually do that. Of course, it comes down to whether the person actually is willing to do that or not, but that's kind of, that's just up to each circumstance and each individual. And in terms of, what we can benefit from in our conversation in discussing it, we have to discuss what the person can do in order to come to genuine knowledge. And regardless of whether they will or won't, again, that's all up to whatever each individual does in their circumstances.
Okay.
All right. So, but this whole thing, I think it is so important to recognize when people are afraid of investigating evidence because they think that they could be deceived by the devil by the evidence, so they're going to ignore it. That's a really dangerous place to be, and no one is free from the potential of operating in that way. And so in all things, guys, I really want to encourage you guys, in all things, to be willing to look at the evidence. Never shy away from evidence because you think that, I could be deceived by looking at the evidence. No. Be willing to investigate and judge all things rightly. And in order to do so, you have to become acquainted with the truth. And if someone puts forward what they purport to be evidence, it either is evidence or it isn't evidence. And so it's important to come to an understanding of what evidence is. And again, it's a fact or a series of facts which points to one conclusion over and above any other. And so that's really what it is. Any other comments or questions about these principles?
Yeah, actually, I remember Teresa was talking about secondhand information, but I guess a lot of the time how my brain works is like the information why I'm in branch study group, because the information is powerful, so it overcomes, what's the word? My old belief, and then I studied in this message, and how do I? So it's part of the secondhand information too, because like now, if you ask me about Godhead or ask me more information, I cannot really give a lecture, give them really genuine information about that. So what do you call that?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Okay, so, and I'll repeat that. So the question, from how I'm understanding it, is that basically, isn't everything that we're learning in this message, in a sense, secondhand information, like you're learning it from us and all of that? So isn't that just getting it secondhand? And so am I understanding your question correctly?
Yeah, from the beginning, initially, yeah. Yeah,
so initially, and I'm glad you qualified that, because in the beginning, initially, it is. If you hear me say something, for you to just believe it because I said it would be to believe it just secondhand. But this message isn't about just making claims. This message is about making claims and demonstrating the truth of those claims by means of evidence. And we purpose to put people in contact with the evidence so that they can test what we say to see whether or not it's true. And at that point, even though you heard the claim from someone else, once you test it, once you do an experiment yourself, it goes from being second-hand information to being first-hand information. And what makes the difference is whether you actually do a test, whether you do an experiment. That's what makes all the difference. That's what takes it from second-hand to first-hand, even if your experiment is only indirect. And in order to understand what I'm saying there, I'm actually going to read to you guys something from the What is Truth article, yet to be published, that deals specifically with this question of can you really know something if you're getting it from someone else, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to share this section from What is Truth, and before I read it, I'm going to give you guys a little bit of the context, and some of the context you are already familiar with, and I added these paragraphs in at the end of a section dealing with the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we've actually read and discussed on the calls. So in this What is Truth article, again, the setting is we're wanting to figure out, well, what exactly is truth? And in order to facilitate the discussion in this article, I give an example of a hypothetical conversation between a Christian and a Muslim. And they have a point of disagreement. The Christian believes that Jesus was crucified and died by that means. The Muslim believes that Jesus did not die, whether on a cross or at all. The Muslim believes that Jesus was brought up to heaven in a similar manner, perhaps, to Elijah or Enoch, without tasting death. Well, those are two conflicting views. How do you determine the truth? And this is just, it's used as an example in order to highlight what truth really is. And in order to expand on that example, I have those two having a discussion, the Christian and the Muslim, and then I have an unbeliever come into the conversation. And the unbeliever, not a Christian, not a Muslim, no religious affiliation whatsoever, but seriously wanting to know whether Jesus was crucified or not, and whether any religion has anything to offer. And so there's this investigation that ensues, and in order to get into the principles as to how to learn about the past, I give the example of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the question of the crucifixion is a question about the past and must be examined by means of history. So in order to learn about the past, I give an example to show, well, how do we learn about the past? And the example I gave is the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I showed how when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, there was not certainty as to whether they were really ancient or not. But how was it determined? How is that determined? And what I explained is that, well, the past is no longer with us. It doesn't exist anymore. All we have is the present. But the present has been formed and shaped and altered by the past. And so it was by studying the present condition of the scrolls themselves that their age was able to be determined. And I explained the history of how it was determined. It was determined by three primary means. The first is paleography, which is the study of the form of letters in different periods of time and how they change throughout time. And thus, an educated paleographer can look at an ancient writing if it's in the field and the language in which they specialize, and they can know, the forms of these letters and so on place this text or the writing down of this particular copy of this text in, let's say, the first half of the 2nd century BCE. You could determine it within about 50 years or so. So paleography was one of the means that was used. The second was radiocarbon dating. And this is done by the use of equipment known as accelerator mass spectrometry, which actually counts the individual carbon atoms in a given sample. And then you can compare the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 atoms, and then just do the math with the rate of decay of carbon, and then you can figure out how long it's been since the animal skin upon which the text was written, how long it's been since that animal died. You can determine that, and then that helps to figure out the date of something. And the third method was archaeology, which was excavating the Qumran site, demonstrating the connection between the site and the scrolls, and dating the layers of the site by means of pottery and coins and so on to establish the date. And all of those together formed a harmonious picture and showed exactly the period from which the scrolls came, the time in which they were written. Okay, so all of that is nice, but man, that requires some specialization. Not just anyone can look at something and determine by means of paleographical analysis when this was written down, because you have to know a lot about the forms of the letters at different periods of times and all of that. It's a very technical study. Counting the individual carbon atoms in a sample, that requires some incredible technology and knowledge. You have to have the know-how of what you're doing and how to do the math and all of that. And same thing for archaeology. It requires not only permits and all of that, but it requires having a lot of knowledge, a lot of education goes into that. So all of that can be determined, but how does that help the average person? How does that help us? How do we know whether any of that is valid, and can we? So this is the section that I have written that I'm about to read to you. It's addressing this sort of question. And it kind of deals with this whole secondhand information idea. Suppose for a moment that you are totally unaware of the Dead Sea Scrolls and their history. You receive a package in the mail, and lo and behold, it contains several fragmentary scrolls written in unfamiliar characters. The only other item in the package is a note which says, "You have 10 days to determine the age of these scrolls." What would you do? Would you be able to determine their date? Would you even know where to begin? Most wouldn't. Most people wouldn't know where to begin. If you can't read the characters, because again, it's written in unfamiliar characters, you don't know how to read it. If you can't read the characters, you can't perform paleographical analysis. If you don't have access to an accelerator mass spectrometry facility, you can't count the carbon atoms. If you have not been educated in the methods of archaeology, you cannot perform the relevant excavations. You may not even be aware of dating methods at all. You thus find yourself wholly unequipped to conduct the necessary experiments. My reason for mentioning this little scenario is that it highlights the fact that conducting proper experiments requires the right knowledge and technology on the part of the experimenter. Accordingly, if you were to receive such a package in the mail, you simply would not be able to determine the age of the scrolls, at least not on your own. If you cared to know, you would be obliged to get the scrolls into the hands of those who have developed the necessary skills and specialized in the relevant fields of knowledge. Now comes an important question. So here's the question. Does an inability to personally conduct direct experiments equate to an inability to know the age of the scrolls? And this question could be broadened. Does an inability to personally conduct a direct experiment on anything equate to an inability to know whatever that thing is? One might reason that since you cannot do the experiment yourself, your only other option is to take the specialists at their word. Fortunately, this is not the case. Even though you cannot conduct a direct experiment, you can conduct an indirect experiment. You may not have any knowledge of paleography, but you can determine whether the paleographer does. This could be done by seeing whether their work has been reviewed by their peers, and if such review speaks to the legitimacy or illegitimacy of their methods and conclusions. You could also test the veracity of paleography itself by seeing if it works by sound principles and whether its finds are corroborated by other verifiable methods. This same sort of indirect experiment could be performed in relation to the other fields and their specialists as well. Thus, you can truly conduct experiments. It is just that the experiments which you can conduct are really just testing the legitimacy of the direct experiments of others. This indirect approach is not a lower order of experiment, as some might think. It is actually the only means we have to account for and explain broad spectrums of knowledge. In this way, it would not be unfair to say that it is actually a higher order of experiment, though dependent on direct experiment. This is essentially the way that scientific theories develop. In science, a theory is not a speculation or a guess. It is a system of ideas which seeks to explain vast ranges of facts. Since theories encompass many facts, they naturally represent a higher sphere of knowledge than any individual fact. An individual fact is really just the conclusion of a direct experiment, but a theory is the conclusion of the indirect experiments which test the legitimacy of a multitude of direct experiments. It is the explanation of the broader reality to which the sum of experiments point. So, whether you are an average working class individual or whether you are a scientific specialist, you still need your conclusions to rest on a variety of experiments and not just on the ones you yourself can directly conduct. Thus, specialists in one field should, in addition to doing their own work, conduct indirect experiments on the legitimacy of the experiments of other fields in order to test and corroborate their own finds. Conducting these indirect experiments is not the same as taking someone at their word. We can know this to be so because, while it does require a lot of specialization to know how something works, it does not require much to know that it works. In other words, when it comes to knowing how it works, one must either gain an education or remain ignorant, in which case one would have the option of taking someone at their word. In other words, if you remain ignorant, you might have that option to take someone at their word. You might be left with that. But when it comes to knowing that it works, one often only needs to perform a brief and simple experiment without having to depend on another person's say-so. Take, for instance, a radio. You may not know how it works, but even without that knowledge, you can know that it works, and also that those who designed it genuinely possess the necessary knowledge which you lack. To confirm this, you don't need to be able to repeat their direct experiments. You only need to know how to turn on the radio. So that's the end of what I'm going to read to you, but just to expand on that a little bit, you can gain genuine knowledge of something that you've heard from someone else by testing their legitimacy in regard to that specific point, even if you can't conduct the direct experiments that they conducted. So you might not know how to analyze the forms of the letters to establish the date of something, but you can test whether the person who is doing that experiment is capable of doing it rightly and whether they actually did do it rightly. Let's say you have all the paleographers. You can conduct a test. You can say, you know what, let's see how these paleographers work. Are they just taking each other's word for it? Do they have some vast conspiracy where they want to convince people that the Dead Sea Scrolls are from the first or the last 2 centuries before the Common Era? Or are they arguing about details? And do they have different religious perspectives? Are they coming from different views on life? And are they testing each other's finds independently and verifying them? And it turns out they are. And you can do that even without understanding all that there is to know about paleography. You know, you can test, well, these people who are making radios, I mean, I don't understand radios, but, you know, how does it really work? Well, guess what? My inability to understand how radios really work doesn't mean that I just am taking people at their word that they know how to make a radio and that I just have to trust without evidence their ability. No, I can know that they actually understand it, and at least well enough to make it work, and they have knowledge that I don't have, and that knowledge is genuine. I don't need to be able to repeat their experiment to know that. All I have to do is verify that what they're doing works. You know, you don't need to know how to put a satellite into space to verify that satellites are in space and they actually work. You know, here, very frequently, I can look up and actually see a satellite go past in night. Not during the daytime, but in nighttime, I can see a satellite go past. I can turn on a phone. I can look at satellite images. You know, there's all these things that we have that are evidence of the legitimacy of something, even if we don't know all the details of that thing and we can't repeat that exact experiment. This is the way history works too. history works by indirect experiments. With more contemporary experiments, again, I'm kind of stepping aside from history for a moment, and then I'll go back to it. Any scientist, to do their work, has to corroborate their finds. And no scientist can do every experiment. No, we, to some extent, rely on the experiments of others as well. But it's not relying on their experiment independent of our own. We conduct our experiments to test the validity of the experiments of others. But here's the thing. If you only go with direct experiments, which you can personally conduct, you vastly limit what you know, and you actually ignore multitudes of evidence around you. And it's really a sad thing, and it's totally unnecessary, because indirect experimentation is actually how to analyze data from all these various direct experiments. It's how you put things together to get the big picture. And so this is one of the beauties of something like peer review, or of kind of doing a meta-analysis, looking at something, taking a step back from it and analyzing it, looking at the big picture. So, like, for instance, you could have one experiment that shows one result, but perhaps people didn't do it well, even though it's a direct experiment. Well, maybe even if they did it honestly, maybe they didn't do it well. So how do you test your own direct experiments? You have to compare that to others, but you can't repeat everyone else's experiment on everything. So you do indirect experimentation to see whether their experiments are legitimate. And then their experiments help to falsify or verify your direct experiments. So, for instance, the Cochrane Review, it's a review by the Cochrane Institute, and it deals with tons of medical and health-related subjects. And what they do is they look at individual direct experiments on whatever health and medical points. But they recognize that these individual experiments need to be analyzed together. So they do an indirect experiment, which is testing the legitimacy of the experiments that others have done. And so they'll take a review, and let's say there's been 500 studies on something. Well, this indirect experiment is more important than any one of those direct experiments. It depends on them, yes, but it is more important, because you could have, let's say you have 20 of those 500 experiments that give one conclusion. And let's say someone's on the internet and they're looking up and they come across 10 experiments and they all give this certain conclusion. But what if that 10 is only just a small portion of this 500, and let's say that 500 shows something else? So what is really important is that indirect experiment, which tests the legitimacy and looks at the broad range of information of all the direct experiments and puts them together to see to what does the sum of these experiments point. That is where you have your really solid information. It's at the level of the indirect experiment. That's a level up from the individual facts. That's where you get to a scientific theory rather than just a hypothesis or just one experiment. So you can have the let's just say atomic theory, the theory of atoms. Well, atomic theory is a vast range of information that is the explanation of the accumulation of all the various experiments in relation to atoms. It's taken into account a lot more. It's not just one experiment. So this is the importance of indirect experiment, and that's why it's so valid and so important. And even if you cannot, again, I hope that this is encouraging to you guys and helpful in learning things, even if you can't personally conduct a direct experiment on something, that does not mean that you are doomed to not know it. So long as you have a means of conducting an experiment, whether direct or indirect, you have a means of obtaining knowledge. And when it comes to history, it's the same way. Today, the reason why I can't reproduce some of the paleographical experiments that paleographers have done is simply because of my lack of knowledge. The reason why I can't reproduce the experiments of some of the people in the past in regard to historical events is because that was an event of the past and it's not repeatable. You know, I can't just do that again. It was a particular circumstance at a certain time. And so with the crucifixion of Jesus, for instance, that's not a repeatable event. But that doesn't mean that it is out of the realm of scientific investigation. No, we can conduct experiments in relation to it, but they are indirect experiments because it's an event of the past. And so we cannot replay that event. But we can test the legitimacy of those who did experience those events and the events surrounding them. We can test the legitimacy of their experiments and thus gain knowledge just as genuinely and perhaps even more genuinely than experiencing it firsthand. Because even those who experience something firsthand have to test their direct experiment against indirect experimentation. So we can really gain knowledge about all of these things. I know that I'm expanding further beyond, what the question was that you had, Rachel, but I believe it is really directly dealing with this issue of getting secondhand information and how even if you hear something from someone, that does not mean that you cannot know it yourself. You can conduct an experiment even if it's a circumstance where you cannot directly do whatever it is, whether because of lack of knowledge, lack of technology, or because it's an inaccessible event of the past. That doesn't hinder us. We can actually know. So, all that said, any comments or questions?
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So basically,
cool.
I have been learning how to study a message and the information, all the spirit prophecies, the information that provide for us. Actually, we can find the evidence by biblical Bible versions, linguistic, history, the Word of Hebrews, and the contents, and how do they all connect to each other, and how do we analyze all these data elements in one picture in the prophecy. And even though I don't have a knowledge of the prophets, spirit prophecy, but I can take their information, their research paper, and understand it and digest it and write my own research paper. I mean, in my own way, how to analyze this information logically. And I think that's pretty much I get it. Like language, like Hebrew, I don't need to understand how to say, how to buy stuff in Hebrew, how to go traveling, the language in Hebrew. But all I need to know about the Hebrews is about, like the Godhead, and then and the basic information and stuff. Maybe just like 2-3 hours knowledge of the Hebrew information that I can explain to people. About the Godhead, I don't need to know extra minor details. Okay, that's my comment and my understanding.
Yeah, I think that you're getting it for sure. Yeah, and the Hebrew thing is a good example. You know, you don't need to know the whole language to know that the letter Hey in Hebrew is the feminine, the most generic and common feminine ending to a word. You know, and you can verify that using multiple means and different Hebrew introduction books or whatever. And you know, there's lots of ways to verify that. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really an encouraging thing to realize that not only do we not have to do direct experiments on absolutely everything, but to realize that that's not even the best way to do it. Like, that's an ineffective way, because we have to realize that we are not perfect direct experimenters. We have to test it against other people's finds as well. And so indirect experiment, again, it's not like we can avoid direct experiment. Direct experiment is immensely important, and I don't mean to undermine it in any way. It's actually a necessary part of this. But indirect experiment takes one a step up to really get a broader picture, and it enables people to gain genuine knowledge of something, of that something works, even if they don't know all of how it works. The radio example is a pretty simple one. You can know that a radio works even if you don't know how. So, any other comments or questions? All right. I think that it'll be good for us to close off the meeting then. I just want to tie this in again to much folly as a characteristic or a way of the principle of falsehood. Well, here's the thing. We are learning in this message how to acquire knowledge. That's one of the main things that we're learning. Why? Because this is all about experimental religion. That's how we can really be justified and sanctified and glorified, by gaining an experimental knowledge of the truth. And if we do that, we will be wise. And if we are wise, we will not have a lack of wisdom and a lack of good sense, and thus have folly. So in this, and I'm so grateful for this, Heavenly Family, but in this study, what we're doing is not only learning and verifying, yes, folly is a way of the principle of falsehood. We've been able to determine that quite easily. Not only are we doing that, but we are actually learning specifically how to avoid folly. So that's something I think that we can and should all be immensely grateful for. That one thing should fill us with such immense gratitude that we should move on for the rest of our lives, forsaking folly and gaining an experimental knowledge of the truth in all things. So let's thank our Heavenly Family. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, Heavenly Family, Todah le'emet. Thank you for truth. Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion tonight. Thank you for the questions that people ask and the answers that people give, and just for the love and joy that we have here in this fellowship with each other. Thank you for these people, Heavenly Family. And thank you so much also for teaching us how to avoid folly and how to gain wisdom. Thank you for teaching us the truth of acquiring knowledge by means of genuine experiment. Please help us not to be ungrateful, but help us to be filled with gratitude and move forward in life, conducting experiments, whether direct or indirect, and of course both. Help us to do this and to honor the truth that you've given to us through this means. Thank you so much. Thank you for your love. We ask what we do, and thank you, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch, Hu he and she.
Amen.
Amen. All right. Love you all. Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Sleep well.